Hi everyone, welcome to the Far East Times. I'm your host Elia Ayoub, and today I'm joined by three very special guests from the city of Minneapolis, Nicole, Ed, and Aydin, who are going to introduce themselves in a bit. Obviously, the topic is going to be the ongoing resistance against the ongoing ICE occupation of the city and the state of Minnesota more broadly. Um, I guess the way we should do this, or the way I usually do this, is we can just start with some intros, and as part of the intros, also give us some of the reflections that you've had in the past. How long has it been? Over a month now or so. We can start with Nicole, and then doesn't really matter, Aiden, and then Ed.
Great. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to have this
Hmm.
conversation. My name is Nicole Bedera. I'm a sociologist. I live in Minnesota. My research focus has always been in gender-based violence, but gender-based violence is one of the cores of fascism. And it
Hmm.
certainly plays a role. It can be the toolkit that, especially poorly organized, and I don't want to use the language poorly trained necessarily. It's pretty fraught right now. But when fascists haven't learned a different, more specific toolkit, gender-based violence is the type of oppression they often fall back on. And I'm here because watching the discourse that was happening around Ice Watch in the public, it really wasn't matching up at all with what I was seeing in Minnesota and also what I knew to be true as a sociologist who studies things like de-escalation. So that's what I'm here to chat about today.
Hi, folks. I'm Aydin. You've probably heard my voice one or once or twice before on this podcast. I usually hang out in the background of the from the Periphery network, doing production work and editing for Antidote Zine as well. I am a community. I have just a community member in Minneapolis. I've lived here for a little over 7 years and have been involved in various grassroots movements in Minneapolis proper in 2020, especially, and in Minnesota more broadly. And yeah, you know, I like resistance movements are a focus of mine, both in the media work that I do and in my community building work, my organizing work. This current moment, it's not even necessarily that I'm like super actively involved in a whole bunch of organizing so much as this is just happening in my neighborhood. I go to work, I say, come home from work, I get just yesterday I was driving home and got redirected on my like mile route, my mile commute home because a street was shut down because they were busy snatching somebody. Like it's just everywhere, every day. So I'm gonna try my best to be coherent. I might lose my train of thought here and there. It's
That's
been a
fine.
lot to keep track of. So yeah, there's a lot to reflect on here. I'm really happy to be here with you both or with all of you to talk about it. I haven't managed to really piece my thoughts together in writing. So we're gonna try
Mm,
talking about it first. But thanks for
perfect.
having me. And it was really great to be with you, Nicole.
Ned?
Yeah, hi, I'm Ed Sutton. I am also a Minneapolis resident. I'm actually Minneapolis born and raised, although I spent a good deal of my adult life in my 20s and 30s living elsewhere. But I came back to town like a week after Trump was inaugurated in 2017, the first time. So I'm sort of like a combination Minneapolis native, lowercase n, and transplant, and have been doing what I can to organize in the communities I've lived in since moving back after sort of cutting my teeth in autonomous movements in Europe. Um, Mostly in this particular struggle, I've been very behind the scenes, much as I am also behind the scenes in the from the Periphery Collective. I'm doing like media support work and a lot of mutual aid coordination, and partly working in a variety of different neighborhoods around the city, since I feel most rooted in the neighborhood that people are probably hearing about, called Powderhorn. And that's where I'm doing most of the like the food delivery coordination and things like that that I will probably not talk about in a lot of detail, for reasons that should be obvious. But I've also, like, I don't actually live in that neighborhood anymore. I live in a different part of the city closest to the river, where there are a lot more resources, and trying to help people in this neighborhood get those resources into the neighborhoods that are most affected by this occupation and the violence from the federal government. Um, and yeah, I'm not sure what else to add for now. We can talk a little bit more about Antidote Zine maybe at the end. I'm a co-editor of that publication alongside Aydin. So thanks
Mhm.
again for having us. And yeah.
Thank you all. I mean, so this is one of those stuff we had to postpone, I think, a couple of times, and even in that time frame, a lot more has happened. I believe actually in one of those when we extended the first time, Alex Pretty hadn't been murdered yet, so that happened. Um, this is one of those topics that I'm assuming, based on the listeners and years of doing this, that a good chunk of them will know the basics. But I also don't want to assume that that's the case. So we'll do our best to give context when we can, all of that stuff. This topic is also both national and international. Like there was a protest in Milan against ICE like the other day because for a reason that I haven't even looked into that much yet, they decided to bring ICE to support the Winter Olympics as security in Italy, which somehow makes sense. Um, I lost my train of thought and I wanted to make a joke about Italy, but I will not do that. Um, what is significant about the protests against ICE, the mobilization, for those like listeners that are like me, who maybe did not know much about Minneapolis and Minnesota more broadly, outside of obviously this is also the place where George Floyd was murdered 6 years ago now, 5.5 years ago, or so now, and the launching of Black Lives Matter and all of that stuff. The way I have kind of two questions, and I'll start with the first one, which is the broader one, which is that in the past month and a half or so, how have you been seeing the development of the response, response against ICE? What are certain things that are working? Uh, the things that are not working, maybe we can leave it for in a bit, otherwise it's a bit too much of a question. And yeah, maybe just your general reflections, and then we can get into some of the discourse around it and whatnot, because there's quite a lot to get through. And it's one of those topics that, because it's been talked about so much, and in some circles, not necessarily like in a helpful manner, in other ways, more productive and so on, depending on when and where, that a lot of people wouldn't necessarily know how to even engage with this. Like, oh, this thing is happening over there. People there seem to have it covered or have their shit together or whatnot. What can I do? Which is what we'll leave towards the end. Like, what can folks outside of Minnesota help? How can they help and whatnot? Yeah, there isn't really any. I guess I can start with Nicole as our non-FTP guest. You get the the first seat. Um, yeah, general reflections really on the past month and a half or so now almost.
Yeah, well, I think you're right to say that a lot has changed over the past
Mm,
month and a half. And also, there are some things that have been, I don't want to say steady, but that the story starts a lot sooner than people outside of Minnesota, which is the state Minneapolis is in, than they would necessarily realize. So, for example, a lot of the people I know, I'm not from Minnesota, my friends and family, a lot of them are not Minnesotans either. They think that the story started with ICE killing Renee Good in public at the beginning of January. But ICE actually came to Minnesota at the end of November, and the community has been organizing since well before that. And so that's a really important thing for people to understand. And that part of why Renee Good was where she was because she was engaging in ice observation or ice watch. And that was really started by a lot of places like PTAs because we knew the ICE would be targeting schools. And so you're hearing all these jokes about wine moms and stuff like that. But the reason that, they're misogynistic, but the reason people are making those jokes is to try to defang the reality of what ICE has been doing in our community for a lot longer than 1 month, which is targeting schools, as has happened in past movements. Women and mothers joined together through schooling students are where a lot of this organization started. Certainly not all of it, but that's why Renee Good knew what to do when she saw ICE, felt comfortable stopping, felt like she could do something. And so there's been this sort of perception outside of Minnesota that after a white woman was murdered, that all of a sudden the state of Minnesota started to care. And that just could not be farther from the truth. I think the more accurate description is after that escalation from ICE. I know everybody I know said, well, I'm doing one thing. Could I do two? Could I do three? And that's a much more accurate way to think about it. And so when we're thinking about what has gone well in Minnesota, part of it is that this is not purely reactive, that a lot of this resistance has been going on for a lot longer than people think. And so at the beginning, when ICE first got here, there were some bigger displays, but it was a little bit more similar to what we'd seen in other cities like Chicago or LA, where it was targeted into specific neighborhoods or communities. A lot of people across the state of Minnesota could go about their daily lives without necessarily seeing very much, but people who were closer to anywhere where there was a specific group being targeted, some of whom are immigrants and some of whom are not, some of whom are legal citizens, So it's really, we're talking about targeting of different groups of people of color from very specific ethnic communities, as well as places that were just caught up in the Black Lives Matter protests of 2020. So, if you live close to an area that was on the route for the march, you probably saw ICE before January, right? Even if you were in a neighborhood that was pretty white, you probably saw ICE before January. I know that I did. And so um, there's it's hard to know even where to start because there's so many different phases of it. But some of the things that you would see in that early phase were things like certain corporations or organizations allowing ICE to use their facilities. Target comes to mind. I have very darkly joked that I can see ICE whenever I want by going to the Target by my house because it's one of the places where they use the parking lot on a regular basis. Target is giving up their employees to ICE on a regular basis, as well as their shoppers. And so there were places like that that you would see ICE more commonly. And things like ICE Watch and ICE Observation was a lot more focused on specifically around things like school pickup and drop off. And after Renee Good was killed, things changed really dramatically, where now I see ICE observers every time I leave the house. I see ICE observers much more often than I see ICE. And there is a sense that they are hugely outnumbered, even as the number of ICE agents has increased following these moments of public interest. There have also been more reporters than there used to be. There was a sense that nobody knew what was going outside of Minnesota, except, it's just the Minnesotans who knew. And now there's a lot more focus and attention. And I don't know, it's just sort of escalating from there that I actually want to say that because I don't even think it's escalating. I think that ICE is attempting to escalate from there and that the resistance has been quite effective. That if you think about the way I know I was thinking after Renee Good was killed, a lot of people in Minnesota were worried that was about to become a weekly, daily occurrence. And it hasn't not happened since then, that kind of lethal violence and a lot more violence that could be lethal. And it hasn't been just by luck, has happened here. But part of why we haven't seen those things that we feared the worst was because of this resistance effort that's coming up. And I know there are other people here who probably know a little bit more than I do, but when we talk about resistance, one piece of it is ICE Watch and ICE Observation. And then other pieces are things like mutual aid. And that is ever changing based off of the needs of people who have essentially had to go into hiding because public is unsafe for them. And they are doing things like having their neighbors bring them groceries. And, we're coming up at the beginning of a new month. And so rent assistance is a really big thing right now. There are people who are offering to help walk dogs, people who are helping people figure out how to give birth at home and get citizenship documents for babies born at home. So really anything you can think of that you would leave your house in Minnesota for, or, anywhere in the world you would have to leave your house for. In Minnesota, there are people who are getting it all done at home on the grace of people coming together because they think this is wrong. And these really organized resistance efforts that have, in many ways, replicated most of the basic roles of a society. That's me talking a lot. I think that covers some of the basics and how things have emerged. But I want to make clear that as much as ICE is escalating, the community and people outside of Minnesota too have escalated as well. The amount of resources that have been driven towards this effort is pretty astonishing, unlike anything I have seen in my lifetime.
Certainly, yeah. I think, in terms of like where did this all come from, as far as the resistance goes, right? Like what's amazing about this moment, and what a lot of people, what is fortunately getting a fair amount of like media attention, is how widespread these tactics are. Everybody is, or not everybody, but like most people are willing to, if they hear whistles outside, if they hear honking outside, which for those who maybe are a little bit less familiar, the main tactic that people in the community, that community members have been using, let's distinguish this early on. This is not necessarily people who are like gearing themselves up every morning to go out and protest, right? It's just people going about their daily lives who have a 3D printed plastic whistle around their neck or on their keychain. People who are in their cars driving to work or driving to the grocery store, who are seeing ICE agents and letting their neighbors know, letting the community know by making some noise. These tactics have become really widespread because they're accessible and they're effective, and anybody who is willing to go out there and even stand like a block away, as long as they can see them and let their neighbors know that the feds are in the neighborhood, they will do that in general. That has been a very, very widespread and common practice. And that, I mean, we can trace that lineage of community resistance pretty far back in terms of the organizing parts of it. Like, we saw how they responded in Chicago. A lot of those folks taught us how to do things. People were doing whistle trainings well before ICE arrived, especially well before ICE arrived in mass. We saw how people in Los Angeles responded this summer. I remember hearing directly from people this summer in Los Angeles about the mutual aids portions of this specifically, that they were developing these really widespread underground networks of people connected to their neighbors and helping each other out. We traced a lot of the things that, a lot of the organizing, a lot of the community response here. I think we trace a lot of that back to how things were in 2020. That was a time where everything was shut down, and the only like legitimate, quote unquote legitimate reason that people could find to leave their house was either to go to the grocery store or to go to the protest, or to go like do a mutual aid project, right? Like, I remember having these really intense meetings with my roommates about like what's okay to do and what's not, and it's like, well, put your mask on and go share food with people, like that's allowed, right? Like everything else, like that's extra, don't do that. But these things, like, we need to be taking care of our community, and that was such a widespread thing that really unified people here, and that lives in like a very embodied memory here. Like that was also a time where a lot of people were meeting their neighbors. It was also a time where people were creating these group chats, where people were keeping an eye out for what's happening on the street, where people were looking out, for the cops back then. Now it's the feds. It's basically the same thing, right? I think like the sort of more common confusion around like, are these protesters, are these organizers, are these community members, what's the difference? It's like, that distinction doesn't matter that much to me. I think in previous moments it was more obvious, like who was a community organizer that was really trying to bring people together, and who was like showing up to the protests for the first time. At this point, it's like it's all of us. Everybody understands that they need to do their part. Everybody is doing the best that they can to participate, and that's what's been so incredible and so heartening about it. And not to forget at all at any point that like people are being snatched out of their homes and out of their cars and out of their lives. They're being sent home to situations that they fled from for a fucking reason. Like, let's make sure that we don't forget the severity and the gravity of this situation. It's really horrifying. It's really scary. It's got us all really fucked up, and it's hard to watch. And that's why people are leaving their homes to go and say, please don't do that, or not even please, but like, stop fucking doing that. So anyway, I just wanted to trace a little bit further back beyond 2020 even. There's been a lot of like a long history of resistance in this area. A lot of people from Minnesota went over to help fight against the Dakota Access Pipeline and Standing Rock. People here fought against a pipeline in northern Minnesota, Line 3, that unfortunately they built. That happened in pretty large numbers. There was also, in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement, Philando Castile, after he was murdered, there was some pretty great resistance here around that. There's a lot of people have been talking about the American Indian movement that was founded here. That goes back a few decades. And then if we want to trace that even further back, I mean, like, it's really the symbolism of this whole situation, where they're keeping migrants and where they're bringing protesters to the Whipple building that's down by Fort Snelling. Fort Snelling was a concentration camp for the Dakota people in like the 1800s. This is it's they're still bringing people to that place to deprive them of their basic needs and to just to torture them and to kick them out and to try to either like force them to leave or to kill them, right? Like that's still happening. That history is still continuing, and it's been hundreds of years. And it's amazing to watch the entire community say, stop, it's enough, we need this to be different. We don't believe in this system anymore. I'm seeing people who have bought into the system their entire lives see this stuff happen now. I mean, especially after Alex Preddy was murdered, and say that this can't happen anymore. And there's part of me that's like, obviously like a little frustrated that it took that long for some people to understand that. And on the other hand, I'm like, welcome, that's great. Like there's a long history here. This has been really fucked up for a really long time. And honestly, I don't care if you got here yesterday, or if you've been here your whole life, like we all really need to be working together. And that people are really, really waking up to that. And that's been really powerful. Even on the other side of it, from the organizers' perspectives, like a lot of us who sometimes are skeptical of like people who just got here, like what are your motivations, what are your political affiliations, all this stuff, like we're leaving that stuff for a reflective like later conversation. Right now we're all just really willing to band together to try our best to respond to this current crisis. So anyway, I just wanted to kind of like outline a little bit more of the longer history to all of this, because I feel like it's important context for what's happening here. And one other little additional context, there's this little shout out to St. Paul. They always get left out. Minneapolis and St. Paul, the Twin Cities metro area, a lot of people are doing really important and really amazing resistance in St. Paul as well. There's a lot of awful things happening to slightly different set of communities out there. And they don't get talked about as much because, I think partially because the 2020 uprisings happened here in Minneapolis, but yeah, it's like an entire metro area coordinated effort, and there's other things happening in other parts of the state that are also connected to all of this. So like it's not just like one neighborhood, it's a lot of people. So I'll stop there.
And they're literally touching. So for people who don't live in Minnesota, the Twin Cities are called that because they are literally separated in some parts by a river, in some parts not even by that, but they are literally touching. And so in some way they are two separate cities, but of course they're wrapped up in it together because it's essentially one large, consistent metro area.
I guess I'll just jump in very briefly for a couple of reflections. I feel like Nicole and Aydin already covered most of the ground that I would have wanted to as well. Just to emphasize what Nicole was talking about in terms of the misogynistic nature of this assault, it's something I've been thinking about and something that I think hasn't been um, emphasized enough in a lot of the media reporting, just as like, and where it comes from in this like basic fundamental thrust of fascist formation. It's been very, very apparent when you see that it is like specifically sites of social reproduction and like the labor of women and especially women of color that is being targeted. And the effect that that has had in the last 2 months and especially, but like historically under capitalism, this has always been the case as well, has been like economically devastating, right? Like when you target those sites, kids can't go to school, teachers can't teach, caregivers can't give care. Everything else shuts down too. Nobody else can go to work when that's happening. And so like the visible physical violence that's happening to specific people is one layer of it. And I think what's underneath that, as is becoming clearer and clearer, and I think like the true extent of the fallout remains to be seen, is the economic devastation. And I think that people in this city are going to be struggling for a long time to come because of the damage that's already been done, just up to now, and which continues unabated. And yeah, all the more reason that we need to be continuing with especially the mutual aid side of the resistance, because like, yeah, it doesn't appear that there's going to be any going back anytime soon to some of the structures of support provided by either the state or commercial institutions that we've been so used to relying upon. We're really learning the hard way what it means to have to rely on one another. And the amazing thing is the way people have been showing up for that. And I think there's a broad consciousness now that yeah, again, this is just the way things are going to be for a while. And like perhaps we can keep doing it indefinitely, whether whether forces require it or not, in scare quotes require. I think there was another thing I wanted to touch on as far as like the roots of some of this resistance and some of this organizing in 2020 and before. A friend of mine, it's funny, some of the media reporting that has happened this month as a response to uh like yeah, just the international headlines and everything like that. We've had a lot of national reporters parachuting in. Some of the bigger publications, East Coast based publications in the US, have at least like tried to send reporters who have roots in Minnesota so they know a little bit more what they're talking about. And that has meant that I know a couple of these people. I'm not going to say who or which outlets, but one of them I had a conversation with when he arrived, and he was bouncing some of his ideas and analysis off of me to see if like if I thought he had um something right or wrong about this, and I thought that this was actually like very smart. And the reason I want to give him credit is so that I'm not presenting it as my own idea, but he was drawing a contrast between uh, the 2020 uprisings and what's happening now, by sort of like describing the divisions that were happening, especially among like kind of like the hegemonic white liberal South Minneapolis population um, during the 2020 uprisings, that during the like so-called racial reckoning, and all the giant protests against police violence and for racial justice. There, you know, in 2021, our mayor, who has also been making headlines this year, Jacob Fry, was reelected, despite, and like we joked bitterly about that being like the reelection of the Minneapolis Police Department, and essentially after that whole racial reckoning, right? And that was an indication that, you know, there were a lot of activated people in South Minneapolis, and that the protests against the killing of George Floyd and against just like decades of police terror more generally was a multiracial movement, but it didn't actually include a lot of the more um, privileged members of our like the white polite liberal society in South Minneapolis. And in fact, there was a strong backlash against those protests that was then reflected in these electoral results that I mentioned. And you can contrast that to what's happening now, where it's really everybody's in it and we're all in it together. And what I was telling my reporter friend is that like I've never seen Minneapolis as united as it is now. Um, Despite there having been so much lauded work in 2020 about how, like the multiracial character of those protests. I mean, having lived in Powderhorn at that time, which is a very diverse neighborhood, immigrant populations from lots of different parts of the world, it was a multiracial protest. I was there for a lot of it, and you saw a lot of different colored faces, and most of them were masked, thankfully. But there were people that felt excluded. I know from talking to neighbors that like they weren't welcome there. They didn't feel comfortable if they, you know, weren't fluent in English, or I don't know. There's all these different divisions that were kind of thrown into relief at that time, that it was clear that radical autonomous movement was going to have to figure out how to deal with. And now in 2026, uh, it feels like those neighbors that hadn't felt like they could be involved for one reason or another before are in fact involved in one way or another now. A lot of it, if we want to just like sort of talk about the racial breakdown of some of this stuff and the economic breakdown of it, it is like rich white people who, with the privilege of their identities, can be out in public, who are doing a lot of things to support their neighbors who can't, who are typically brown and poor. And right now, it's a donor-recipient relationship. I'm hoping that moving forward, these things can turn into a more like reciprocal relationship and put the mutual into mutual aid. Once like the pressure, hopefully, cross our fingers, is off, we can like move forward as like a really unified community rather than having this kind of like um, these hierarchies sort of built in. And I think it remains to be seen how people move forward in this, but I see a lot of hope in the unity that is emerging now compared to in 2020 when things were so fractious. And one of the things that's really great about that is that like the attempts, the classic attempts that we all kind of know about that are being made to like divide people who are participating in this resistance movement by the media, by the government, by like trying to like pit good protesters against bad protesters, et cetera, et cetera. Um, and like, I don't know, to say nothing of outside agitator narratives and like everybody, like the accusations of like domestic terrorism, et cetera, et cetera. Um, that stuff isn't working. And neither are like attempts at federal government infiltration of our mutual aid networks, for example. Like these people who are coming into movement now, even if they had been standing on the sidelines before, and we were sort of bitter about that in previous cycles, are learning fast. And something about like the community rootedness of all of this organizing makes it a lot easier for people to tell when somebody doesn't belong and somebody's not from around here. And so there have been attempts at infiltration by like undercover agents or informants of some kind, and they get chased off right away. And the security culture that I'm seeing in this movement that is populated by so many, what I would maybe describe as like uninitiated people, is actually like way more robust and a lot healthier than what I've seen even in like some of the forest defense movements and like water protector movement, excuse me, movements that I didn't mention before, like a bunch of sort of like paranoid anarchists out in the woods, not trusting anybody or even each other. It's a huge contrast to what I'm seeing here, where there's so much unity and like certainly a good amount of like vigilance, but actually a lot of trust and a lot of unity in the way that we're moving. And it's just it's astonishing to see, and I want to see it continue.
Can I pull a couple of threads together that I think kind of explain this moment for people who aren't here? So,
Please, yeah.
yeah, one of them is a lot of what Ed is talking about, the academic term we would use for the sort of after effect is structural violence. That the thing that is getting out into the media is ICE's in the moment physical violence that is injurious or lethal. And a lot of what's happening here, if you the closest thing I can compare it to, if you're not in Minnesota right now, is the shutdowns in 2020 of what it was like when people who needed medical care could not access it. What happened to that little thing that you might have gotten checked out right away that you couldn't? And so instead, that small wound turned into an infection and required a lot more treatment. So that's happening in all of our social institutions in Minnesota again. And because of the extent of the structural violence, specifically for targeted communities, which includes, again, immigrants, but also communities of color more broadly, the amount of need is so significant that some of the initial barriers that people have about coming into activist movements, like, oh, I don't know if I want to go to a protest. Oh, that seems a little scary from what I've seen in the news. They're falling away because when we are replacing all of the different components of a society, it is so easy to go to someone and say, well, what would you do for somebody if they just gave birth? You would bring them food. And there are people who are giving birth in their homes. And so they might also need their dog walked. They might also have all these other things that are happening. If there are people, children whose parents were abducted by ICE, they're going to need childcare. They're going to, we're having conversations about things that are really, really uncomfortable, but also bonding around what people's vulnerabilities are. Things like, yeah, what does happen to a child if their parents are abducted? In some really horrible cases, if there hasn't been enough of a network in place from the community, the children have had to go to ICE detention because there's nowhere else for them to go. And so when these are the types of crises, we're not talking as much about what's the political platform in this moment, although it's becoming really clear that abolishing ICE is a part of it, that all of these things are impacted, that people are becoming more radical sort of along the way, but they're learning by doing. And I have yet to find anybody in my life who hasn't been able to think of something that they would be willing to do to help. And I think that that entry point is part of what makes this reaction so different and why it is so unified is because the problem is so big. So it's a double-edged sword. It makes it easy for people to come in, but also I think everyone's right that we're going to be dealing with the fallout from this whenever it ends, however it ends, for a very, very long time.
Yeah. Thanks for those reflections and pulling out those threads, Nicole. I wanted to do the same for a second here. A couple things to note just about the culture of Minnesota that people might not know, especially seeing what they're seeing on the media right now. I've lived in a lot of different places, and I found it really remarkable when I moved here how hard it was to find like racially mixed social spaces. Like this, there is in general a sort of like I don't I don't really know how to describe this. Like growing up just outside of New York City, like you kind of run into people of a lot of different walks of life just like existing in the world because it's such a densely populated place. But Minneapolis, for example, like the place that I have the most experience is a place that a lot of people like grow up and they grow up here and they stay here, or they grow up here and they come back here, like Ed, for example. And it's a lovely place, and there's a lot of diversity here, and there's a way where I found it very strange how like separated a lot of like social spaces can be in a way that was less salient in like bigger cities. Um, so the ways that people are connecting with each other across those lines here is in a way pretty remarkable, because that's been something that for whatever reason has been pretty hard to break through even in 2020, when people were really out on the streets together, like building like deeper social ties, deeper connections, actual like dependence on one another, interdependence, connectedness, like that still feels like a newer thing, at least from an outside, like a slightly outsider perspective. um and there's this thing people talk about is Minnesota nice or Midwest nice, right? Where it's like this sort of like saying goes that a Minnesotan will give you directions to anywhere other than their own home. It's like people are pretty friendly. Like you can say hi to someone, you can ask someone for help if you need it on the street, but like there's kind of this like Scandinavian cultural like limit to it. It's like, don't ask me too personal of a question. um and that's something that like is both really working to our benefit right now. People are like, I was yesterday when I was driving home from work and I had to take a detour, I like rolled down my window in my car and stuck my head out the window because I was just curious to see what was going on, and some lady like drove up in the opposite direction, rolled down her window and started chatting with me and was like explaining what was happening. And based on my stereotypes, like this mom looking white lady, I was like, you never would have done that to me before. You never would have said anything to me before. Like, but we're now in this moment where everybody's just like, we really need to be talking to each other. We really need to be connecting with one another. And like Ed was saying earlier, like what builds trust and what enables us to keep going is that we feel that we are all looking out for each other. There's been this really big emphasis on the hyper local. I haven't heard that word said so many times in my life beyond the past month. Hyper local, everyone is talking about it. People are talking about hyper local networks the way that they were talking about mutual aid in 2020. It's become very popular for good reason. It really works. When you know who your neighbors are, you know when someone comes into your community who uh, has bad intentions, right? Or who wants to come after them. When you know who your neighbors are, you know when they're gone, right? When you know who your neighbors are, you know when they're not there anymore. There's a sign at the bottom of my street that, like, and I've been seeing a lot of these up around, that says a neighbor was taken by ICE here on this date. And there's more and more and more of those popping up around. And I think that's really important and really meaningful to remind people, like this emphasis on neighbor, this emphasis on the hyper local, it makes it personal. It makes it not just this theoretical idea of like I mean, of course, Black Lives Matter is really important. It's an important thing that people understand that that is true, that it is a fact, right? That that is conceptually something we should value. And at the same time, like, there's this very material sort of reality to like my neighbor was taken. That goes beyond, like, it makes it more personal for people who aren't being taken or who aren't being targeted, to understand like you have a stake in this. So getting to know your neighbors, like, that's not a political act. You can't get me in trouble for inviting my neighbors over for dinner, right? I mean, I guess you could, but like that would be a really extreme act for the state to do, and we're not there yet. We're seeing anti-fascism become a relatively apolitical thing in this country. That's crazy. You know, like with the rhetoric that there's been out there about what anti-fascism is, now people are saying like, this is a bad idea. We shouldn't be doing this. We shouldn't be engaging in this kind of repression. That's, and like, for better or for worse, that's a narrative that people have this like story of like, that's what people on the other side of the ocean do to their people. That's why we send our troops to all of these like strange foreign countries to go and like supposedly give them democracy, right? It's that shouldn't be happening here, but like it is, and people are seeing that, and it's undeniable.
Just on quickly on the
Go for
neighbor
it.
thing, the way it's been fascinating to see the language being used because in some sense, and I mean I'm assuming you would agree that it disarms the attempt to to drive a wedge and say like there are citizens and there are non-citizens, and by when you say neighbor, well that other category just doesn't matter because what matters is the physicality of being neighbors and whatnot.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think that's right. That's another thing that in terms of like what Ed was commenting on with the aid work that people are doing, people are trying to make that more like bringing the mutual back into mutual aid. I am seeing efforts, right? Like in 2020, there was this kind of like big uptake of the concept of mutual aid, and what a lot of people were doing was, in my opinion, aid, which is great. People need food, people need services. That's important. The mutual portion of it, what's happening now is that I'm seeing, like, instead of there's this big network of volunteers who's getting connected to this big network of people with need, it's one volunteer is getting connected to one family, and they keep that relationship, and that's the family you're assigned to. And so you get to know them, you practice your Spanish. If you don't speak Spanish super well, you check in on them, you see how they're doing, and that's the system that's being set up, right? Those those small tweaks make all of the difference in terms of like the actual breaking through these social barriers and all of this disconnection that we've had here for so long. I think
Can I jump in on the
one,
neighbor thing for a second too,
please go
before
for it.
we
Yeah,
we switch again?
totally.
I also think neighbor is just it's just an accurate way of describing what's going on when otherwise it gets really clunky. So when I was trying to introduce to people outside of Minnesota what's happening, I mean, you can't use the government's rationalization that they're going after undocumented immigrants because that's empirically false. That is not what they're doing. But it also wouldn't be totally true to say that they're going after all people of color because it is more targeted than that still. But if you use language like neighbor, we get you this sense that they're targeting people who are near you, and also our entire community can get caught in the crossfire. That to me seems like the most accurate way to describe it, while also clarifying that the neighbors who are at higher risk are people of color, are immigrants, and specifically really non-white immigrants for the most part. But to make clear that it's just kind of messy when you start, if you have to say, okay, they say they're doing this, it's not really like that. Oh, it's kind of like this though, but not totally. There's a lot of back and forth. But to be able to, in the moment, say, I'm just going to show up for my neighbors. I'm just going to show up for my neighbors. I think that's part of what has been easier for people to explain again to the people who are newcomers into the movement to say, why are we parsing things like criminality or legal status that are so arbitrarily applied by the Trump administration? And for people who aren't here, you might not know that the way the Trump administration is determining someone's immigration status is through AI. They are not accepting documents. So somebody can literally have their birth certificate. They will show it to ICE. ICE will say, well, my app says that you are an immigrant, and so I'm allowed to take you anyway. And we know there's huge racial bias in these apps. I saw one estimate that saw that there was an error rate up to 38% for women of color. And so we've heard reports of ICE, scanning someone's face. It says citizen, scanning it again, trying to change the answer. And so when we have an entry point of talking about how these are our neighbors and that there is no legitimacy to the different types of legal statuses that the administration is trying to apply to them, it's not to create the sense of like it could happen to any of us. I think we're really clear that that's not true. And that's, again, part of why people understanding who's at high risk and who isn't is helping people feel pretty safe and comfortable participating in this broad movement. To some degree, being the person who's left out of it might be the strange thing at this point when all of your other neighbors are participating. But I'm just feeling that kind of sense around the word neighbor that it gets at a lot of these dynamics in this almost coded way that, again, it gets at this idea that, like, should it be illegal for you to bring food to your next door neighbor or to offer to walk their dog? That also breaks down some of these, good protest, bad protest sort of things too, and gets at the ordinariness of how much this has impacted all of our lives. Okay, now go on to your next point.
I mean,
On
sorry, it's related. That the last thought that I had was pretty much this, that
Go
like,
for it.
the violence and the repression and even the resistance to the violence and repression that's existed in the US isn't new. What's new is that people are breaking past these barriers in this like very widespread way. And I think what like I hope that some people who are taking these stories to other places, or that people who are reading these stories from other places and trying to kind of model stuff after how we're doing things here, it's like the main takeaway that I have from all this is like anybody can do this. I've seen a lot of people doing this who I didn't expect to be out here. I've been really surprised, and like a lot, like, yes, the setup in other places is different, but y'all can find a way. Like the hyper local thing, the connecting to your neighbors thing, that is not special. That is not a special tactic. It is not a new thing. It's something that people know have been doing since the dawn of time. Get to know the person who lives next to you. You might not love them, but like when it comes down to it, your lives are intertwined and it's useful to know who that person is, right? So that's all I had to say about that.
No, it's very useful. A slight tangent, but I recently wrote an article on the Reform Party here in the UK, which is the local far-right party or national far-right party, and they have this policy proposal that they would like to implement when they get in power, called Operation Restoring Justice. And it's essentially, I mean, the summary, and there's a long article, I can put it in the show notes I wrote, bringing ICE to the UK, like having a British version of ICE, which they call Deportation Command, which is basically the same thing, having versions of concentration camps, all of that stuff. And one of the things I wrote in that article, because I tried to not make it all doom and gloom, like it's just coming here and it's inevitable and all of that stuff. First, it is not inevitable, like they may actually not win and whatnot. That's a different thing. But also, like, what is happening in Minnesota, and including a lot of links, is an indication that things could actually be done. And there is no like inherent reason why something working over there wouldn't work here if it is also the same kind of patterns of power and domination and whatnot being applied here. Not to mention that like very likely some of the same companies are going to be involved because Palantir and Co are very enmeshed as well in the UK at this point. So that's like one thing. The second thing, and sorry, and like one other thing I mentioned is like I think part one, and like I suggested to just get to know your neighbor. Like that's something really important to know, even if you don't like them, as you said. Like it's not that. We exchange postcards. I don't know most of them really that well, but like we do that, and from time to time I get like some cookies or whatever, and just that's it really. And what that did, and maybe this is like to that point, is that when we had a kind of a medical emergency about a couple of months ago, two of the neighbors came to us because they saw an ambulance. Everything's fine, listeners, don't worry. But like, two of the neighbors came to us and then asked, like, because we don't have a car, we're the only ones in the neighborhood without a car, and said, like, next time, just let us know, we can drive you there and whatnot. And that's just all it took, you know? The second thing, and that's like just a me thing, and it may not be as relevant, but the concept of neighbor and all of that, there's something emotionally very resonant about it. I think, I don't know, it's a very American thing, but listeners would know, like Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, and just like the concept of neighbors, and even like the visuals of like I feel like I've seen that movie in a sense of like an invading force coming and people who are locals telling like they're coming. Like there is some of that I think that at least being played out on the cultural level, which is interesting, which is part of that conversation, but maybe not the focus in the same way. But I definitely find that interesting in the same way that in the UK there are already like existing works of fiction, whether it's Children of Men, whether it's Years and Years and other like stuff like that, that do show the sort of things that Reform, for example, is kind of planning on doing. And I feel like that association would at the very least help, people who may otherwise be on the fence, it could at the very least help that build that momentum, if nothing else. One thing I wanted to kind of get into, because these have been like I've been enjoying so much not having to talk this much. This is lovely on my own podcast, to be honest. But the media coverage has shifted. I would say in the past, week or so. It's good that we kind of postponed for other reasons and whatnot, because then we kind of already seeing this happening when, as far as like, if you only rely on media coverage, I mean, specifically, you might think like the momentum has died, or like things are a bit better now, or like there's been some concessions on the Trump side or whatever it might be. Um, Tell the listeners why that's bullshit.
I wrote a really long viral thread about this. It actually wasn't really long, but I did write a viral thread about this.
We'll include it.
There's this sociological concept called symbolic compliance, which is when there's an organization, I think we can extend it to the government here too, when they are violating our legal rights, and instead of actually changing that violation and following our rights, they give us symbols to make us feel a little better about our rights being violated. And that's not really intended to convince us whose rights are being violated to feel better about it. It's intended to convince the gatekeepers, the people providing oversight. So this would be people like Congress and the judiciary in the US. And so there was a lot of fanfare, I think the media to some degree too. There was a lot of fanfare about Bovino, who had been, very high ranking in the Department of Homeland Security, being moved out of Minnesota. A lot of people thought that this meant that ICE had been moved out of Minnesota. This is not true. A lot of people thought that he would be replaced with someone better. This is not true. There was a thought that it would change or at least reduce the amount of ICE violence in Minnesota. This is not true. It really was. And I've also seen people say he was fired, which is also not true. All that happened was he was moved to California. And so there hasn't been really any substantive change at all. And so in this moment, I think one of the biggest risks, and we've seen this across American history, it's one of the biggest risks when people's rights are being violated is that we get comfortable with it. And the things that to me raise the big red flag of symbolic compliance right now are things like terminations or impeachment hearings of individual leaders, as if they aren't parts of these really large teams. I think something we feel in our bones in Minnesota right now is that nobody is actually capable of that much alone, but we're all capable of a lot together. So the idea that only one or two or three people would go down for this doesn't really make any sense at all. Other things that concern me are things like the idea that banning masks or requiring body cams would be enough for ICE agents when, a lot of this stuff has its roots in the same moment we've been talking about so much. A lot of issues of police brutality, Black Lives Matter in 2020 and 2014, mask bans around the pandemic, 2020 through now. We actually do have some data on how these things work, and we know that body cams do not reduce violence in any significant way. If anything, the cameras face the wrong way. They are not faced at the officer, they are faced at the victim. And it really enables places like conservative media and propaganda to be able to blame victims. Things like taking a mask off. I went down a deep rabbit hole about whether or not there's any empirical evidence that taking masks off of police in particular would reduce police brutality. I didn't really find anything. So a lot of the case for demasking is coming from stuff that, as a sociologist, I would say is pretty different. Things like mask bans for the KKK. But part of why a mask ban would work differently for the KKK is that they might be risking their employment if somebody doesn't agree with their violence. They might be risking boycotts if they own a company, but ICE is employed by the government. And so a lot of those financial incentives around what kind of consequences the public can bring upon them, they're really limited. We'd be really looking for social ostracization. And, I don't know. I think that's an empirical question of would it work or not. In this moment, people are really upset about ICE. Maybe it would work better than it would. But if you were to ask me if just unmasking everybody who voted for Donald Trump would have changed things in 2016, I would say no, right? They have a lot of support as well. And so we're seeing these measures floated around by Democrats in the Senate in particular. I know that is actually maybe where all of my anger came out about everything that has happened. I've been really staying focused on, every time I get upset to put that energy into helping instead. And that was the one thing that kind of cracked me for a minute to say, wow, they might actually make things not just not better, because that's one issue about symbolic compliance, that it would be ineffective, but it's actually a way of manufacturing consent, which can make things a
Mm,
lot worse for us. And so things like we've been talking about this hyper-local response in Minnesota and rich white Minnesotans putting their money where their mouth is to support people. Well, that's been happening nationally. We've been getting tons and tons of donations from all over the country, all over the world, and it would be materially harder to do what we're doing if we started to see that support eroded, or if people started to think, well, why aren't they grateful enough? Or, all of these things that can happen in a white savior dynamic, right?
mm.
Which is part of why mutual aid being mutual is so important, is it interrupts that white savior dynamic. And so, yeah, that's a big part of what we're seeing right now is this push for symbolic compliance. There's been a lot of pushback, and I would say that if you're listening to this, if you can think of any way to continue to push back, including, again, just talking to people who already care and saying, don't fall for it, that would be hugely useful right now. Because the reality is, yeah, things haven't changed here in any material way. And if people are feeling better about it and it's easier for them to look away, if they think they'd be more comfortable watching ICE snatch people off the streets if they weren't wearing masks because the video itself would be a little less scary, that's not the kind of intervention we need right now.
I mean, to your point on the camera, then the guy who killed Rene Good was filming himself, right? Like
Yeah,
that.
he was
That's one of
Yeah.
the
filming
videos we
himself.
have.
Yep.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
So,
And filming her to be
Yeah.
able
and
to
filming
say,
her,
look,
yeah,
she wasn't compliant enough. And there's
yeah,
been so much
yeah.
victim blaming around Renee Good and her wife in particular.
It's really awful. Yeah, I
Uh,
mean,
Please go for it.
there's
Yeah.
there's like, I think the other piece about this whole connecting with your neighbors thing is like if people know their neighbors and their neighbors have been taken and their neighbors aren't coming back, like that's bad, right? That's not going to get any better. That's not going to change. I mean, there's a house nearby where I live that housed I think about a dozen folks in a family, in an extended family, and I think it's like half or a third of them are left. Some of them have quote unquote self-deported, which is also like a whole other dynamic that's been happening here. People are really scared and they're leaving. I mean, it feels like silly to even say. It goes without saying, people don't like uproot themselves from their lives and their home and their family and their connection to a place without a really good reason, right? And so coming here, like there's a lot of these folks, like everyone had a really good reason to come here, and going back to those conditions is a really intense decision to have to make, but things are so bad here for them that they'd rather go back and get taken, tortured, or killed, right, by the fucking Gestapo. So there's an article in our local newspaper that I usually really don't I don't like how they do reporting, but there is a good article in there that we can link in the show notes as well, about the conditions in the Whipple building, where migrants are being detained, and about how bad it is for observers and how much worse it is for migrants, that they're like just stacking people into rooms, like really awful, inhumane conditions. I don't need to go into the details here, but if you want to read about that stuff, you can. That's lifelong trauma. This kid, Liam Ramos, who was brought down to Texas and has been brought back, so happy that he's out. Like, really a lot of love to the family. And like that kid, I mean, he's one example of many, many stories like this. Like, he's going to be traumatized probably for a very long time, right? Like, these things aren't just events, they are processes. It's structural. Like, this is an ongoing process that is having a deep impact in our community, and not just obviously to our neighbors, our migrant neighbors, but to all of us watching this play out. I mean, if you go every single day, you watch someone get taken, like that memory doesn't go away, that experience doesn't go away once it's over, that doesn't go away once they say, oops, sorry, like we'll stop, or we'll like do things like we'll send Bovino away. Gregory Bovino, for those who you don't know, like Nicole mentioned, was the sort of head honcho that they brought in to try and put on a show, and then it was too inflammatory to have him here, so they said, well, let's get him out of here, as a sort of like halfway scapegoat, and that didn't work on us. We were like, okay, like fuck that guy, he's leaving, but like they're still here, they're still taking our neighbors are still gone. So the point being, like yeah, it's bullshit that things have died down because they're still around here, and because the impacts are much further lasting than these individual events. And I think there's like that sort of what was the word that you used, the compliance,
Symbolic compliance.
symbolic compliance. Yeah, I mean that's a really helpful framework, and I think that's a really important thing that like those of us who like study social movements in other places and are connected to social movements in other places, we've seen how bad repression can get in places like Iran and Syria and Russia. Like resistance there is, I would argue, way harder, and people are still doing it because they know how bad it is and they know how important it is, and they're fed up, quite frankly. And the stakes are like so high. I mean, for all of us, but they're still protesting. They're still saying, like, they're still fighting for their dignity. And I think it would really behoove us here to learn from, to connect with those movements and to connect with those struggles, because I mean, it's different context, it's a different history, and at the same time there's a lot of the like playbook, the authoritarian playbook that's playing out here. Every time they do something new, I'm like, yep, seen this before. Like there's steps that they're taking along that way to try and like get us to a similar place to the repression that's happened in other places, and we could really stand to learn from the resistance that's continued in those places as well. And I mean, all solidarity to the people who are dealing with that shit in other places. Like, it's really, it's horrifying. And I mean, now I'm having, like, my Iranian friends are reaching out to me and being like, are you okay? That's I mean, I'm like, yeah, are you okay? Like, like, it's nuts to be in that kind of place. But what's happening there is that people are recognizing that, like, what they've done to us, they're doing to you. What they're doing to you, they will do to us. Like, it's not just our neighbors here, it's our neighbors around the world who, it's the people around the world who have been facing this kind of repression. The stronger we are at saying, no, this is unacceptable, the more it will become unacceptable. Right? Yeah, it feels a little like, I don't know,
No, I mean,
cliche, but
I
yeah.
don't think it is. I mean, to your point, everything, not everything, but a lot of what's been happening in terms of the tactics being used, and especially like the discourse being deployed. As someone from Lebanon, I've seen this before. You know, Lebanon is nowhere near as violent or bad as like, government-wise. I mean, as Iran is. There's no comparison between the two, but there are some similarities. We've been accused of being foreign agents. Mendassin means infiltrator. All of that stuff being paid by foreign governments. Paid by the embassies, paid by. We're not even from Beirut. We're actually from the north, coming into. But all of that stuff. So these things absolutely do have these resonances, and it's very useful for anyone who, I think, especially who has doesn't have these or let's say these resonances don't come to mind, like they don't know much about Iran or whatever it might be, to know some of this just in terms of like there is an underlying authoritarian playbook. It's not the same, it changes, it adapts. The logic is almost identical in terms of what the goal is, in terms of the very least what the impulse might be. Again, it changes, and most importantly, the consequences are not the same. In Iran, the death toll is in the tens of thousands, like in the lowest estimate. So like when it's not that at all, but the government is acting on, almost under the same logic. It's just that the government has over there, the state has essentially concluded that if they don't do this much, they can actually collapse. They can actually, they could actually be overthrown. Like that is a possibility that they think about, and so they have basically take, mass execution, all of that horrible shit that we're seeing in Iran. And these things, like people really need to get beyond the idea that it cannot, quote unquote, happen over here, right? Hopefully it never does, and I would love that never, for that. But in order to make sure that it doesn't get there, all of those steps. That's it. I wrote about this in that piece on Shadow Magazine, is the website, on reform, which is that one of the problems with fascism is that it tends to start very slowly and then it speeds up. And the trick is to not have to wait until it speeds up. And so one of the potentially good things, silver linings about the shit show that's happening in the US, is that in the UK, it hasn't yet gotten to that level yet, but there are signs that it could. The current government is in the same way that, Obama and Biden has facilitated a lot of this apparatus, building up, not building up, but like expanding the capacities to deport people, all of that stuff. And then it took a Trump 2.0, even more than Trump 1.0, to expand all of this and get more aggressive about it and whatnot. The Labour government is doing this today. They are the ones sending out data to Palantir. They are the ones thinking of mass surveillance. They're releasing ASMR videos about deporting people, like MAGA is doing, like in the US. And we don't yet have a quote unquote the far right party that could actually come into power and then accelerate all of this, expand all of this and whatnot. Which is, we're luckier in that sense that we may have some time. In theory, we could have up to 3 years if we're lucky, 2 3 years, to actually prevent that from happening. And so that's one of the silver linings, and says that you're not just suffering on your own over there. Like this is actually being watched, and because it is the U.S. and of course the U.S. is in its impact and whatnot, this is also being observed from outside of the U.S. and it's creating all of these connections that are, I think, authoritarians tend to be pretty bad at anticipating them. So that's something we do have to our advantage. On that note, in terms of just slowly wrapping up because we've come to time and amazing, no complaints there. Um, Anything else? Hey, first, like anything else we did not cover that's really important? Let's just start with that.
Um, Maybe this is a whole other, it's probably a whole other rabbit hole, but just that what you were just saying, Ilya, was just kind of bringing up this sort of train of thought around like we're having a crisis here right now, and I'm curious your thoughts on this, Nicole, from a sociological perspective as well. Like, it's really common for people to want to turn out when a crisis is happening. You know, it's that sort of like very typical story of like a quote unquote natural disaster happens and everybody comes outside and helps one another out. And you know, you always sort of wonder like why didn't people feel like urgent enough to get connected before that? And I think something that has been very unique about this particular city, Minneapolis, and the Twin Cities metro area in general, is that context of like people 5 years, 6 years ago, were very like aware of how important it was to connect with their neighbors. And while maybe we didn't all stay in touch with our neighbors, there's still that kind of like backdrop of like, oh right, this is what we do in a crisis. We connect with our neighbors, right? So it became a lot easier for people to just kind of plug in and do that right away here. But there are ways where like we could have been much better prepared for this moment, right? And like you're saying, Elia, like people in the UK could start getting ready for a crisis now. It would make them a lot more better prepared to do that. But like, where is that sort of motivating factor? Like, we don't want to be operating from a place of urgency and fear. We do want to do the basic things that like maybe later on you'd be surprised at how important it is to know who your neighbors are and how they behave and what their rhythms are. But how do we get people to understand on a broader scale that like the crisis moment is not the best moment to do like groundwork laying stuff? And where is the, yeah, like, I don't know. I mean, yeah, maybe that's my sort of lingering question here.
Yeah, it's making me think a lot about the research I do on gender-based violence and abusive relationships, this entire conversation, because the same sort of trends that abuse in a relationship starts off small. Do you really notice it at first? It slowly changes, slowly changes. And then it's the moment when the abuser has structural control. That's usually when physical violence starts. So after something like a marriage or moving out of state, where the victim is now isolated from their support system, those are the moments where it tends to become physical, where it's the highest risk. And so a lot of what I'm thinking about now is the same stuff that I would say when people ask me the same question about seeing a friend who's in an abusive relationship. And they say, okay, I can see from the outside that this is concerning behavior, but they don't see it. They're not ready to see it yet. And one thing I'll say is that from interviewing victims, they're often more aware than people think, but that they do need material support to be able to actually leave. They do need to stop blaming themselves. That's one of the best indicators of whether or not someone will leave an abusive relationship is, do they say it's all my fault? If it's my fault, I should stay and fix it, fix him, right? And so instead to say no, it's the other person's fault. I'm putting the blame where it belongs and acting accordingly, including things like violating some of the rules that we would have for other types of relationships, right? So things like to be able to leave an abusive relationship, you have to be able to keep secrets from your partner. And that's something that a lot of people in healthy relationships might wag their fingers at you and say, how dare you keep a secret from your partner? But that's really important to be able to leave. So knowing that you're in a situation that requires a different toolkit than if you were acting with somebody in good faith, recognizing you're interacting with somebody who's in bad faith is really, really important. But the other thing I would say through this entire dynamic is that I think there's this tendency for people to wait for other people to validate that it's time to get started, to tell them, oh, like, I just wish that other people, these people in power would come and save us. I think that's really common in Western communities where there's an expectation of this like white savior who's going to come in and fix you. And so I think one of the things that I've been saying to people outside of Minnesota right now is whatever you wish everyone else was doing, just start. Whatever that is, Just start doing it. And so if you wish other people were meeting their neighbors, go meet your neighbors. If you wish that people were spending more time volunteering, we haven't really gotten into this yet, but one of the things that makes Minneapolis unique from other cities in the US is we have a very high rate of volunteering among adults. I don't remember the exact percentage, but it's somewhere between a third and a half of adults in Minneapolis volunteer every week at some kind of organization, which is also part of why we're so embedded. And so, this idea of why is no one doing anything is something we hear a lot, especially since we've become more isolated, especially since we're surrounded by propaganda that's really convincing us to be cynical and to believe that nobody cares as much as you do. That's one of the things that I have felt really flipped on its head during this time in Minnesota, to be like, wow, everybody around me, a lot of them actually did care as much as I did the whole time. And some of them got started before I did. I've been doing stuff for a long time, but I was not first. And so this idea of, instead of thinking, okay, I'll show up when everybody else shows up, to say, how can I create the foundation? And then as well to think about, in the US, we've had a really long Trump discourse about like, go fight with your uncle, your MAGA uncle who voted for Trump, and try to change his vote, which has been so unsuccessful. They get so much counter programming for that. They're really prepared for that fight over the Thanksgiving table. And something I've been saying a lot recently is you can't educate people who don't respect you. And so education cannot be the tool if, your racist uncle and you are, I would be the woman at that table. That's just probably not going to go great, right? I just don't have the power to change his mind. But if I focus all of that time and energy into deepening solidarity with people who already care, that can go a really long way. And I just want to say that, like, if you're thinking, okay, so how do we get started early? A lot of people would be thinking, well, I don't need to bring food to my neighbors yet. So how do I get started early? And I'll just give the example of what I was doing during Trump 1.0 that is actually like really working out now. After the Kavanaugh hearing, which for people outside of the US, Kavanaugh's one of our Supreme Court justices, it was very contentious. I think over half of Americans watched some component of the proceedings because he was accused of sexual assault by multiple women, very credibly. It's, if we lived in a world where we could be more honest, I would say that he sexually assaulted multiple women. But anyway, so after that moment where it felt like this big loss, I had a group of friends that were all really upset about it. And so we decided that we were all going to learn fiber art crafts, so like knitting, crocheting, felting, whatever, and get together every other week forever, for as long as we all were in the city. And so when something like a protest came up, I didn't have to think, well, I want to go, but I'm scared. Who would go with me? It's a little intimidating to go by myself. Where will I find parking? Those logistical things that get in the way. And instead, I had my group of friends. And at any given time, I think at least half of us came to every protest that was in our community for the entire first Trump presidency. And then we all moved away because we knew each other from grad school. But those people are the people who've reached out to me since the ICE occupation has started in Minnesota. They are still protesting in the cities that they're in. They are building similar networks in the city they're in. And so much of this is just getting in touch and spending time in the same place as each other. And it can be fun. It can be fulfilling. Nobody has to be your soulmate. Find your people who are your good friends and find those soulmates. But also, there is a place for those sort of acquaintance, sort of Scandinavian style relationships where you wave at each other, but you're not going to be having dinner because who knows what would come out. That's okay, to have those types of relationships too. So anyway, this is a really long way of saying that these early stages, when you're noticing it, the early stages of organizing are just keeping people who are already on your side on your side. And that's a big part of how we keep authoritarianism from spreading, and making sure that when it's time to reach that crisis place, you have a network together that can do those crisis related things, like giving people, to go back to the metaphor of an abusive relationship, giving somebody a place to stay, giving them some money so they can get a new apartment, giving them childcare because now everything is so disrupted. Like those types of crisis responses, they take people who are willing to pool their resources to pull them off. And so the part now is the people part.
That's also great. And I think if I have anything to add to any of it, it's less about like preparing now for potential futures and more about like conversations with people who are here now about the past in a way. I guess what I'm getting at, and this is maybe just like saying what has already been said in a new way, is trying to encourage folks to map the outrage they felt at being lied to about the killing of Alex Pretty and Nicole Good, Renee Good, excuse me, onto previous police lies about their murders of other people in history and ask, when they said Tortuguita had a gun in their tent, was that true? Are we believing it? And I know that's a more complicated example because there are people who are like, yeah, maybe they did. So what? And that's another great question.
Can you
Um,
explain
but
just
like,
brief
oh,
and
excuse me, yeah. For folks who don't remember, this was in 2021, three, two? I don't remember, January something. An anniversary just passed of, I believe it was Georgia State Police who killed a forest defender in the Wilani Forest who was protesting against the construction of Cop City. Yeah, I don't want to get all the way into that because I'm not as familiar with that struggle. Although there are, I think, important connections between that struggle and struggles that have historically happened in this geography in Minnesota. But like maybe just to move it to a more broad, like just the Black Lives Matter protests of the previous decades, right? Like we can just talk about all the police killings of black men and women, where the claim was there's an officer who feared for his life, this and that. And they can make up all kinds of stories about what happened to make the victim look like they deserved it. And I want people to be able to sort of like map the rage that they feel about that happening to a white person and give the same credit and benefit of the doubt to previous victims of police violence through the decades, through the centuries, and just know that this is just a continuation of the same shit with a with a different face on it that might make you a little bit more sympathetic, but like let's extend that empathy now too, also to previous cases of this and probably future cases of this. The next time that a law enforcement agency, whether it's local, county, state, or federal, commits this kind of violence, they're gonna start making shit up immediately. That's the first thing that happens. And just a reminder that like that is why in the early goings that the community response to the killing of George Floyd got so ugly so fast is because they fucking lied about it and nobody bought it. And they stuck to their story until they couldn't anymore. And that's what's happening now. And I think as long as they keep lying, we're going to keep resisting. And we just need to remember that this is what always happens.
Well, and I want to add on to that too, just the importance of intervening on victim blame in general. The idea that anyone deserves to be killed by the state. I think if we're trying to push back on fascism, we should be thinking about that not just in a situation where someone is shot by the state, but also, again, like we were talking about these cases of structural violence. Most people, to our knowledge, who have died in ICE detention have died because of a lack of access to medical care. That also should be inexcusable. This idea that anybody deserves to die at the hand of the state, that's always something that I am trying to question with people as that sign of like, what have we already gotten too comfortable with? What kind of violence is already feeling normal to us? That's the language that academics use, is the normalizing of violence. Why do we now, instead of saying, wow, I can't believe that somebody was killed at the hands of the state, we say, well, what's the circumstances? Was it merited? Do they deserve it? As opposed to, again, like this is a very American conversation. In most countries, police do not carry guns, right? And like that is really something specific to us in a lot of ways. And the idea that we have this kind of lethal violence on a regular basis in our country is something that's specific to us in a lot of ways. And so, yeah, there's a lot of, again, examples of if you were to look back at any situation and say, where were the signs that this came from? What made this all feel normal? What made it not feel outrageous the second it happened? Those are the exact types of things we should think about it in those early stages where we know it could escalate.
Yeah. One other thought, and this has been sort of said already in this conversation. I think you were talking about this earlier, Nicole, that like there's this sort of in some circles a sort of newfound skepticism around leaders, our leaders being able to take care of us or protect us from this, and this sort of like, oh, maybe the governor and the mayor can't actually do that much, or maybe the police aren't going to do anything to protect us from the feds. Like, there's this sort of weird, there's this it feels like a sort of American thing too, where I'm so tired of hearing this narrative of like, if we just elect the right person, it'll change everything. And there's this very sort of hero energy or hero story. We love a hero story. We love a Batman. We love a Superman, all this stuff. And I think what people are seeing now is that the thing that makes like our biggest guarantee to, or biggest like chance at having some amount of like safety and security in life is if we connect with one another, if we take care of one another. There's all of this really incredible rapid response and mutual aid infrastructure that's popped up, all of these different networks that have really figured out how to stay rooted in their local communities. And I'm really curious to see what would happen if we solidified those networks more, if we didn't let them die down, if and when this crisis passes or changes. What happens if we decide that the state probably can never be counted on to fully take care of us? How do we figure out ways to do that that are much more in our own control and in our own hands? Obviously, like we have a long way to go in that regard, but there are a lot of things that we can do for one another that we don't necessarily need to compromise on. There's and again, like this isn't to sort of like romanticize that. We can't count on donations coming in forever from other places and from here to spread resources around to feed people forever. That's probably not how it's going to go. But how do we build networks where like we are able to like long term rely on one another for things that we might have otherwise relied on, like a nameless, faceless like person behind a desk offering us like social services, like that is a whole other conversation. But I just want to encourage people to think a little bit more about like, what have we built up in the moment of crisis? What kind of networks and infrastructures have we built up in a moment of crisis that could be more uh take up more of like a place in our life? And there are other places in the world that like have figured that out little by little, and have like made entire projects out of autonomous societal infrastructures. Like we could really be looking at that and trying to figure out how to do that, because that is when it's ultimately going to be more of a guarantee long term.
Yeah. I mean, what else is there to add, to be honest? Um, I guess just yeah, in terms of wrapping up everything that we've mentioned, I'm gonna of course re-listen to this. I'll include all of these in the show notes. Anything else that we should include? If you can't remember on the spot, you can just message me and I'll include those in the show notes as well. Besides that, Ed and I did ask one of you to talk about Antidote Zine a bit, and Nicole, please do mention where people can follow your work and whatnot as well.
Okay, I'll go first so Nicole can have the last word. Check out Antidote Zine. We're an official affiliate of the From the Periphery Media Collective. We've been publishing since 2013. I'm a co-founder. Me and a couple of Swiss comrades founded it when I was still living there. And we have a few different topic areas that we like to cover. Among them is like a general no borders movement approach. And I don't know, I wasn't totally prepared to get all the way into this, so I won't. But there's a bunch of fun stuff there for people to read that like might actually provide some of the context that Aydin was just talking about, when it comes to the ways that people have self-organized to meet their own needs and to exercise their right to autonomy of movement all across the world. And also, the Fire These Times back catalog of episodes is a great place to learn more about those sorts of things as well. And one of the ways that Antidote Zine interacts with this podcast as well as the other podcasts within the From the Periphery Network is by producing transcripts when we can of some of those conversations to make that information more accessible to folks that don't enjoy or can't access audio content.
Mhm.
So that's about it. And I feel like I have other things to add, but we have been yapping for a while. So I'll just turn it over to Nicole. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, this has been a great conversation. To stay in touch with me, I'm on Blue Sky, just N Bedera, Bedera, my last name. And then if you're curious, we've been having this conversation about what happened before this moment, what were the canaries in the coal mine. In the US, One of them was the attack on universities, and specifically the attack on Title IX and women on universities. The way that the Trump administration set the stage for giving rapists impunity for their violence very closely mirrors to the way they're trying to get impunity for ICE for their violence. And so I wrote a book about that. And so if you're interested in what some of these early warning signs look like, it's called On the Wrong Side: How Universities Protect Perpetrators and Betray Survivors of Sexual Violence. And one of the big takeaways is that if our institutions are already promoting inequality, they are vulnerable to this type of authoritarianism. And so making sure that everybody is actually able to access the legal rights they have on paper is one of the early fights that I wish we would have participated in more here.
Hmm.
So those are the places you can find me. And then I'm the only person with my name in the world, so I'm an easy Google as well.
I will include a link to the book as well. Folks, do buy it from your local bookstore if you can, please. Besides that, everyone, thank you so much for doing this. This was amazing.
Thanks, y'all. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for hosting.
Yeah, thanks a lot. This was great.